issues. Very briefly about our speaker, I came to know Tammi Rossman-Benjamin a number of years ago when I visited her campus, her then campus, the University of California at Santa Cruz. Tammi taught Hebrew there for a number of years. She's no longer an active faculty member. Instead, she devotes herself day and night to monitoring anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and other outrages on American campuses through an organization she co-founded several years ago called AMCHA. I'm sure we'll learn a little bit about that work as she makes her presentation. It's done invaluable service to all of us in getting us to really understand the nature of the problem, meeting Jewish students on university campuses, and on trying to figure out how to deal with all of that. Her own thinking continues to evolve in these matters, as we'll hear in her presentation. I'm sure it will lead to lively discussion by so many of you who are listening in. It's great to have Tammi with us. It's great to have all of you with us as well. Without further ado, Tammi, it's my honor to hand over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Alvin, and thanks, Gunther, for this incredible webinar series. The whole series has been really first rate, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of it. And many thanks to those of you who have tuned in this morning in California, this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending where on the globe you are. I recognize many friends and allies, and I'm glad that you're all participating in this webinar. And I look forward to, as Alvin said, a lively discussion after my presentation. So for those of you who aren't familiar with AMCHA Initiative, the organization that I co-founded and directed, we were founded in 2012 to monitor, investigate, and combat anti-Semitism on college and university campuses. And I'm going to be telling you a lot about what we've monitored and investigated recently in the last few years that really inform our thinking about anti-Semitism. So if you'll excuse me, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to move to a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, are we up? Okay. So today I want to talk about some interesting but troubling findings that AMCHA Initiative found recently in our in our 2019 study. Specifically, we found a nearly 300% increase in student and faculty rhetoric openly challenging the widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism that identifies anti-Zionism as anti-Semitic. This included dozens of claims made by anti-Zionist students and faculty that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, or that Zionism is not Judaism or not an inherent part of Jewish identity. We also found that such expression was very strongly correlated with the harassment of Jewish students. So before unpacking these findings, I'd like to give you some context for these data by first providing a bit of background on what AMCHA studies have shown about the nature and scope of campus anti-Semitism and the factors that allow it to flourish. Second, by showing why it's been so difficult to ensure that Jewish students are adequately protected from campus anti-Semitism. Third, by describing recent attempts that have been made to ensure adequate protections for Jewish students. And finally, by presenting a new way of thinking about campus anti-Semitism and how to address it. But before I dive in, since we'll be discussing disputes over the definition of anti-Semitism, it's important to tell you about how our organization identifies it. So, in determining what constitutes an anti-Semitic incident, we make a qualitative distinction between two different kinds of behaviors. The first kind of behaviors are those that are directed at or disproportionately affect Jewish students or Jewish members of the campus community at large, and cause them some measurable degree of harm. For example, assault, bullying, denigration, suppression of speech, destruction of property, etc. We call these targeting Jewish students for harm, and sometimes we refer to them as anti-Jewish harassment. The second kind of behavior that we monitor, which is primarily speech, sometimes imagery, are really expressions of classic or contemporary anti-Semitic tropes specifically directed at Jewish members of the campus community, but that don't cause them measurable harm. We call this anti-Semitic expression. And in determining whether any given expression is anti-Semitic or not, we use the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA definition, which, as you may know, identifies anti-Zionist expression as anti-Semitic. Anti-Zionist expression is understood by the IHRA definition as not simply criticism of Israel, but opposition to the very existence of a Jewish state, including by calling for, including by painting Israel as a pariah state that's so evil that it has to be eliminated from the family of nations, demonizing Israel, or by explicitly calling for or condoning the dismantling of the Jewish state. The IHRA definition has been adopted by 26 countries, including most recently last month by Spain, and a version of the definition has been used by the US State Department since at least 2010. So here are some of the findings our studies have revealed about anti-Semitic activity at American colleges and universities. I want to start with the targeting of Jewish students, or anti-Jewish harassment on US campuses. And our studies have generally shown increasing numbers of incidents targeting Jewish students for harm, which you can see in this graph. But these figures really don't tell the whole story. Because while acts of classical anti-Semitism have, over the last few years, increased to near historic levels in America, at large, off campus, let's say, on college campuses, classical anti-Semitic harassment, such as swastika graffiti, the distribution of neo-Nazi flyers, the vandalizing of a Jewish student's mezuzah, the harassment of a Jewish student wearing a kippah, acts of classical anti-Semitism like these have actually been decreasing significantly on college campuses over the last few years. And on the other hand, Israel-related harassment, incidents that demonstrate anti-Israel animus on the part of the perpetrators, either through their use of language or imagery containing anti-Israel messages, or through the targeting of identifiably pro-Israel individuals, for example, a student wearing an IDF t-shirt, or the vandalizing of Israel-related objects like an Israeli flag, or the disruption of pro-Israel events. Israel-related acts like these have actually been increasing significantly on college campuses. In 2019, for instance, we can see that classical anti-Semitic harassment on campuses actually decreased by about 50%, while Israel-related incidents increased by about 60%. Even more striking is that an analysis of these two different kinds of anti-Jewish harassment, namely the classical anti-Semitic and Israel-related harassment, showed that less than 1/4 of the classical anti-Semitic incidents were directed at specific Jewish students or student groups on campus with an intent to harm those students. For example, we found there were lots of instances of, say, swastikas in campus bathroom stalls that didn't have the specific address of a student or student group on it. On the other hand, about 94%, almost all, of the incidents of Israel-related harassment were directed at specific Jewish students or student organizations, really suggesting to us that anti-Israel harassment has far more of an impact on campus climate for Jewish students than classical anti-Semitism. A final difference between classical and Israel-related harassment of Jewish students can be found in their respective adaptability to online campus platforms, which of course are what we're seeing these days. In 2019, only 12% of classical anti-Semitic harassment occurred online or in campus forums that, since the onset of the pandemic, are routinely held via online platforms like Zoom, such as classes or speaker events, or even student government meetings are now on Zoom. During the same time, meaning in 2019, 72% of Israel-related harassment either occurred online or was easily adaptable to online transmission. In the current virtual campus environment that we find ourselves in, we therefore predict a continued decrease in classical anti-Semitic harassment and an increase in the incidence of anti-Zionist harassment. Our studies have also shown that Israel-related harassment is not only increasing in quantity, but becoming increasingly hostile towards Jewish students. For example, from 2017 to 2018, incidents involving the denigration or public shaming of pro-Israel students, like the example that we heard in Alvin just talking about the USC student, calling these students racist, white supremacists, supporters of genocide or apartheid. Incidents like these actually more than doubled 2017 to 2018, and they continued to grow in 2019. And the same thing with attempts to exclude or boycott pro-Israel students and student groups from campus activities, or even from campus altogether, with calls like Zionists off our campus or Zionists not welcome here, which we've actually documented on several campuses across the country. So now I want to talk about her rhetoric or speech, anti-Semitic expression that is Israel-related, or anti-Zionist expression. So our annual studies have also shown a steadily increasing amount of student and faculty anti-Zionist rhetoric that demonizes and delegitimizes Israel, for instance, calling Israel a racist, apartheid, or Nazi state. And at the same time, we found that the nature of anti-Israel rhetoric is becoming more focused on Israel's destruction. It's becoming more intense and more hostile. And for example, between 2017 and 2018, expression promoting or condoning the elimination of Israel as a Jewish state more than doubled, and it continued to increase in 2019. Regarding BDS activity, so since our organization has been tracking anti-Israel divestment resolutions, which is really since 2015, there have been 72 what we call economic boycotts. The divestment of universities' financial holdings in Israel is a kind of economic boycott. We found that 72 such votes of whether or not the school should divest have taken place on about 44 campuses, with students voting for divestment in about half of those cases. Now, you have to understand that while these efforts generate a lot of sound and fury, they have never resulted in a school's formal boycott of or divestment from Israel, not once. However, in the weeks-long campaign promoting these resolutions, they have been extremely effective in injecting onto campus enormous amounts of propaganda portraying Israel as uniquely evil, as a pariah state worthy of elimination. It's clear that the true goal of these divestment campaigns is not to hurt Israel economically, which it just is never going to do, but rather to destroy Israel's reputation on campus, which actually makes them part of a different kind of boycott that's far more pervasive and impactful on US campuses, and that's the academic boycott of Israel, or academic BDS. So while academic BDS ostensibly targets Israeli academic institutions and scholars, they actually have an even more profound and negative impact on US campuses, on students and faculty on US campuses, and that's in several ways. So most obviously, cutting a school's institutional ties to Israeli academic institutions and scholars means that students or faculty on US campuses who want to study or travel to, or even study about Israel, or to do research with Israeli scholars, they have their academic freedom violated. So in 2018 and 2019, we had several examples of these harms. We had faculty at the University of Michigan refusing to write letters of recommendation for students wanting to study in Israel, and almost 1,000 individuals signing a petition in support of these faculty, saying that they too would refuse to write letters of recommendation for their students wanting to study in Israel. We had the faculty senate, the whole senate at Pitzer College in California, voting to shut down their study abroad program in Haifa. And we had members of the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU voting to cut all ties with NYU's Tel Aviv program. There were also numerous efforts by anti-Zionist student groups to stop Jewish students from participating in trips like Birthright. In 2019, the evidence of such behavior, of attempts to actually stop students from participating and faculty from participating in programs like these, the incidence of such behavior actually increased by 100%. More insidiously, however, is the behavior consistent with academic BDS guidelines call to ensure that Israel is not what's called normalized in the global academy. These anti-normalization efforts have led to attempts to cancel, shut down, or disrupt Israel-related events and activities that are organized by students and faculty. Most insidious of all, however, are the academic BDS guidelines promotion of what they call a common sense boycott against individuals who express support for Israel. Compliance with this common sense boycott has led to numerous incidents involving the public shaming of students or student groups, or their exclusion from campus programs and activities because of their alleged support for Israel. And as Alvin mentioned, the recent incident of the USC student who was forced to resign her position as vice president of the student government because of a social media campaign vilifying her because of her support for Israel is unfortunately a perfect example of this common sense boycott. In 2019, the number of incidents involving academic BDS compliant, either anti-normalization efforts or these common sense boycott behaviors, increased significantly. So finally, the last piece of kind of data that I want to share from our studies is that we've consistently found the harassment of Jewish students is strongly linked to three factors. First, schools with Students for Justice in Palestine or a similar anti-Zionist student group were 7 to 8 times more likely to host incidents that targeted Jewish students for harm. Schools with one or more faculty members who endorsed an academic boycott of Israel. So just having the presence of faculty who support an academic boycott of Israel raised the chances that a school was going to host incidents of anti-Jewish harassment. And schools involving student or faculty anti-Zionist expression, including BDS promotion, were about 4 times more likely to host incidents of anti-Jewish hostility. So to sum up these trends, over the last few years, anti-Zionist harassment has been rising sharply in both the number of incidents and their intensity or hostility. And such incidents are strongly linked to anti-Zionist students and faculty, as well as to anti-Zionist expression, including BDS promotion and implementation. Let's call these trends the first part of the problem for Jewish students. The second part of the problem is that despite these troubling trends, university administrators have often ignored or downplayed the anti-Zionist motivated harassment of Jewish students. This is true even when the level of harassment meets the behavioral standard in the school's harassment policy. In other words, behavior that would be responded to promptly and vigorously, where directed towards members of certain minority groups, has generally been not responded to in that same way, or with the same promptness and vigor, or sometimes it's not been responded to at all when it's linked to Israel and directed at Jewish students. The reason this is so becomes apparent when you look at the harassment policies of many US colleges and universities. So here is the UC Berkeley harassment policy. And as you can see, it contains pretty typical verbiage for university harassment policies. Actionable harassment, and it's important to note these things, actionable harassment is defined not just as unacceptable conduct, in this case, as conduct that so substantially impairs a person's access to university programs and activities that the person is denied equal access to the university's resources and opportunities. But harassment is also defined in terms of both the victim's identity and the perpetrator's motivation. In other words, in order for the designation of harassment to apply with this policy, and for the university to actually do something about it and address the behavior, the perpetrator's behavior has to not only be sufficiently severe and or pervasive, etc., it must also have been directed at a person because of his or her membership in a protected identity group, specifically in a group whose membership is based on race, color, national or ethnic origin, etc. What this effectively means is that a student can be the victim of conduct that meets the policy's behavioral threshold for harassment, but he or she is denied redress from such behavior because the perpetrator was deemed to have been motivated by something other than the victim's membership in a protected identity group. Under this policy, a Jewish student can be the victim of severe and or pervasive behavior that denies his or her ability to fully participate in campus life. But if the perpetrator of that behavior is not deemed to have been motivated by the victim's Jewish religion or Jewish ethnicity, but rather by the victim's support or perceived support for Israel, which is often not seen as part of a Jewish student's religious beliefs or ethnic heritage, then university administrators don't feel obliged or don't feel obligated to address the harassment, and therefore they usually don't. Now, I'm using the word obligated very intentionally here because university harassment policies were established to ensure that schools are in compliance with state and federal anti-discrimination laws, which prohibit the harassment against students based on their membership in protected identity groups. Schools that permit such harassment can actually be penalized up to and including the loss of their government funding. So obviously school administrators feel a legal obligation to enforce their harassment policies when it comes to behavior motivated by prejudice against a protected group, but they don't feel any real obligation, certainly no legal obligation or incentive, when the behavior is not so motivated. Now, this highlights the fact that the real source of inadequate protection for Jewish students from anti-Zionist motivated harassment is not university policies, but rather the state and federal anti-discrimination laws on which those policies are based. The important, or the most important and relevant of these, is actually Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which set the stage and continues to play a major role in how acts of harassment are viewed and treated on campuses across the country. So Title VI prohibits discrimination and harassment on the basis of race, color, and national origin in all federally funded institutions, including virtually every college and university in the country, both public and private. You'll notice that religion is not a protected characteristic under Title VI, And for decades, Jewish students were not considered eligible for protection under this law. But by 2010, the US Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, or OCR, the federal agency tasked with enforcing Title VI, had issued policy statements affirming that Jewish students would be protected under the law as members of an ethnic group. And I want to mention here that this landmark achievement of having Jews recognized as a protected group under Title VI was largely thanks to one man, Kenneth Marcus, who not only recently served as the OCR head, but also served as its head in 2004. And at that time issued the first policy statement directing OCR officials to include ethnicity, including Jewish ethnicity, of course, as a protected characteristic under Title VI. However, even after 2010, Title VI complaints of Israel-related harassment of Jewish students were regularly dismissed by the OCR, in part because the office did not deem such conduct to be directed against students because of their Jewish ethnicity. In other words, the OCR did not believe that behavior motivated by anti-Zionism or hatred of Israel was anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews. So since 2016, there have been several efforts by mainstream Jewish advocacy groups to remedy this problem by focusing on getting the US Department of Education and more recently state agencies and universities themselves to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which, as we mentioned, identifies anti-Zionist expression as anti-Semitic, and to use that definition in adjudicating cases involving Israel-related harassment of Jewish students, in order to show that what's motivating the harasser is indeed anti-Semitism and therefore actionable under anti-discrimination law and as well as university policy. So in 2019, these efforts reached their peak, I would say. Pro-Israel students on several campuses sought to enshrine the IHRA definition in resolutions considered by their student governments, with mixed results. The Florida State Legislature passed a bill that contained the full IHRA definition and mandated that the state's public schools and universities use it to ensure that anti-Semitism is treated like racism. The US Congress considered for the third year in a row the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, requiring that the US Department of Education use the full IHRA definition in adjudicating cases of anti-Semitic harassment under Title VI, though the bill failed for this third year again to pass into law. And finally, in December of 2019, President Trump signed an executive order directing all executive departments and agencies charged with enforcing Title VI to use the full IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So, considered against the backdrop of these efforts, it's not surprising that 2019 saw a sharp spike in campus expression challenging the IHRA definition's identification of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and that such expression was strongly linked to anti-Zionist students and faculty who are themselves often directly responsible for behavior targeting Jewish students for harm. Nor is it surprising that the rise in challenges to the IHRA definition was also linked to increased activity of anti-Zionist Jewish groups like the Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP. So although anti-Zionist Jews represent a small fraction of world Jewry, for obvious reasons, I think they play an outsized role in legitimizing arguments that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, or that Zionism is not a fundamental part of Jewish identity. These challenges to the IHRA definition have really been, I would call them a double whammy for Jewish students, because not only have they led to their increased harassment, they've also undermined efforts to ensure that Jewish students are adequately protected from that harassment. The challenger's principal argument, and this is it, that the IHRA definition falsely identifies anti-Zionist speech as anti-Semitic. This is their argument, that if you use the definition, that it will label speech that is just critical of Israel. It will label it as anti-Semitic, and if adopted, it would have a chilling effect on freedom of speech, and it would undermine academic freedom. Well, that argument has made many university and government officials hesitant in using the definition in adjudicating cases of anti-Zionist harassment. In a place on a university campus where academic freedom of speech are paramount and so important, the argument that something suppresses speech holds weight, and I think has impeded universities from actually using this definition. So the dilemma for officials becomes even more fraught in light of the fact that a large majority of the reported incidents of Israel-related harassment are actually restricted to verbal or written expression and don't involve physical contact with victims or vandalizing of their property. And of course, on virtual campuses where learning and social interaction occur online, practically all of the harassing behavior is verbal or written. So given the extent of the pushback to the IHRA definition and its linkage to anti-Zionist motivated harassment, it's really not clear how effective efforts to use the IHRA definition and civil rights law to address Israel-related anti-Semitism will ultimately be. Also, it's important to remember that protection of Jewish students at all under Title VI remains a matter of policy and not law. So this protection is really at the discretion of Department of Education officials and the White House administration that appoints them, or an executive order that could easily be rescinded, making the future of that protection uncertain. So in the meantime, our organization is suggesting another possible approach to viewing anti-Semitism and to protecting Jewish students that does not depend on how one defines anti-Semitism or how one identifies Jewish identity. And as a result, I think it can effectively neutralize challenges to the IHRA definition and to Jewish identity. At the heart of this approach is the idea that nothing is more fundamental to an institution of higher education and the welfare of its students, including its Jewish students, than freedom of expression, the right to form and communicate one's beliefs, one's opinions, one's identity, and to freely assemble and associate with like-minded individuals. These are actually basic liberties that are guaranteed by the First Amendment of the US Constitution. And they're also basic liberties that should be guaranteed by every college and university to every tuition-paying student. So instead of seeking civil rights protection for Jewish students by virtue of their membership in a federally protected identity group, our approach seeks constitutional protections for Jewish students as individuals with the same right as all other individuals to be free from harassing behavior that seeks to suppress or deny their self-expression, including the expression of their identity, irrespective of the motivation of the perpetrator or the identity of the victim. In other words, instead of protecting Jewish students by virtue of their Jewish identity, our new approach seeks the protection of Jewish students' right to express their Jewish identity. And instead of viewing anti-Semitism from the perspective of what is motivating the individual engaging in the behavior, requiring that we actually get into the heart and mind of the perpetrator, which I would submit is a tricky business, we're suggesting that anti-Semitism be viewed strictly through a behavioral lens, as behavior that results in the suppression of a Jewish student's ability to express him or herself or to fully participate in campus life. And we're proposing a number of steps that colleges and universities can take to move beyond the identity-based protections, or to give additional protections than what they currently offer under their school's harassment policy. These include acknowledging the equal rights of all students to self-expression and full participation in campus life, and the equal rights of all students to protection against harassing behavior that impinges on those rights, irrespective of the motivation of the perpetrator or the identity of the victim. It includes recognizing that their school's current harassment policy doesn't protect all students from these harassing behaviors, and that additional policies have to be adopted for this purpose. And it includes establishing robust bullying and cyberbullying policies that, while independent of a school's harassment policy, so we're not saying that they should jettison those policies. We're saying in addition to those, you would have bullying and cyberbullying policies that would be no less binding or well enforced and would use the exact same behavioral threshold as the current harassment policy uses in determining when behavior crosses the line into actionable harassment. And finally, it includes developing fair and consistent protocols and procedures for handling speech that's uncivil or offensive, but still protected under the First Amendment, what we call sort of microaggressions. We believe that there should be one single standard for judging and responding to such expression that does not depend on the motivation of the individual responsible for the objectionable speech, or even the identity or legally protected status of those who are offended by it. In other words, whether a school decides to handle such expression by loudly condemning it or by ignoring it, it should be addressed in an equal manner for all students. So that's the basic outline of our approach. And I'd like to end by saying what I think are some of the real advantages of this approach to protecting Jewish students both in the short term and the long term. So first, our approach eliminates the need to define Jewish identity or prove that Israel-related harassment is motivated by anti-Semitism as a prerequisite for providing Jewish students with the fair and adequate administrative responses to harassment that they should have anyway. In other words, a student shouldn't have to define who he is, what his identity is before harassing behavior is stopped. Secondly, by framing anti-Semitic behavior as an unacceptable suppression of Jewish students' expression rather than an attack on their Jewish identity, our approach invalidates the frequently heard accusation that Jewish students are using the charge of anti-Semitism to silence all criticism of Israel. In fact, this approach underscores the hypocrisy of that accusation. It's those criticisms that are actually being used to silence Jewish students. Third, by stressing the importance of every individual's rights to self-expression and equal and adequate protection from behavior that would suppress self-expression, we believe that Jewish students will feel emboldened or encouraged to proudly express their Jewish beliefs and identity without fear of harm, that they won't feel like victims, they will feel like agents and able to fully express themselves. And finally, in contrast to only protecting students by virtue of their membership in legally protected groups, which can easily lead, and I think often leads, to the exacerbation of group differences and an unhealthy competition for group rights. Our approach offers the possibility, I think, of a healthier campus climate overall. This is not only because group differences become irrelevant when ensuring the protection of individual students, but also because the whole notion of individual rights itself exists within the framework of a set of shared common values, like the equality and dignity of every individual, values that can serve, I think, to really inspire and unite the campus community and that benefit all of its members. So with that, I'm going to liberate your screen from this PowerPoint presentation, and we can open this up for what I hope is a lively discussion.